Thank you for joining us today. We're going to begin our discussion by talking about building a common ground, transatlantic approaches to geoeconomics. My name is Kimberly Donovan, and I am the director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative within the GeoEconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. We will be accepting questions from the audience towards the end of the discussion. Feel free to use the link on the digital program. The QR code is on the back of your badges. And for those of you watching from home, you can submit online questions at askac.org. We will also be passing around microphones, and you can ask questions for our panelists as well. So with everything going on in the global economy and geopolitical landscape today, and the increased use of economic tools to address national security threats, we felt it was important and timely for us to bring everyone together to discuss and better understand the economic statecraft space. Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the global community's response that has created a new dynamic in the way governments work together to leverage economic power and tools, such as sanctions and export controls. As Fred mentioned, yesterday we published our new report where we examine US, UK, and EU approaches to economic statecraft and how these tools are used to advance foreign policy and address transnational threats. This morning, we will be speaking with our distinguished panelists from the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States about where our governments align and diverge on economic statecraft and how things have changed over the past year and a half since Russia invaded Ukraine and what that means in this space going forward. So I'd now like to introduce our panelists. To my right is David Reed, the director of the Sanctions Directorate at the United Kingdom's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, where he's responsible for the development and delivery of UK sanctions policy. Darta Tentere is a policy advisor to the European Union's sanction envoy, David O'Sullivan, and prior to that, she was a policy officer responsible for coordinating Russian sanctions in the European Commission's Directorate General of Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union. Michael Lieberman is the Assistant Director for Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, and previously served as the Director for Europe, Russia, and Iran, and was Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And David Lim is the co-director of the U.S. Department of Justice's Task Force KleptoCapture, which is an interagency law enforcement task force dedicated to enforcing economic sanctions, export restrictions, and economic countermeasures that the United States imposed in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. David, Darta, Mike, David, thank you for joining us today. I would like to begin our conversation by focusing on Russia. G7 and coalition partners levied unprecedented multilateral sanctions on Russia in response to its brutal invasion of Ukraine. We're now almost 2 years into these sanctions. David, if I could turn to you first, can you summarize our lessons learned over the past 2 years? What's working? Where do we need to improve on coordination and collaboration?
Thank you, Kimberly. So let me start by just agreeing with the previous speakers that I think the scale and pace at which we imposed economic pressure on Russia was unprecedented. I think the other thing that has been a surprise, I think, to Putin has been how the unity of the international community has held up. And I was struck by, at a meeting in Brussels earlier this week of sanctions coordinators, thank you, Darta, for bringing us together, how that resolve remains. I think if we look back over the last 2 years, I think I'd pull out 3 things in particular. The first would be just the importance of coordination. I think where we've had most impact, it's been when the sanctioning coalition has acted simultaneously based on the same analysis, thinking back to that immobilization of central bank assets as a particular example of that. But I think what's been important is to keep that coordination intense and broaden it out, including on things like litigation and enforcement. And we're in regular touch with US and EU colleagues on that. I think the second thing has been the importance of the equal focus on implementation and enforcement. So the pace at which we moved has meant that we've had to look hard at where there are gaps in our systems, where we need to invest further. I think in the UK, we're focusing particularly on building out our enforcement architecture on trade sanctions. We're investing through a new economic deterrence initiative, £50 million announced by the Prime Minister in April. But this is a constant piece of work and takes creativity and resolve. I think where we see Russia attempting to circumvent our efforts. Both that international work to challenge that through the engagement we're having with third countries, but also that investment in domestic enforcement is really key because enforcement starts at home. I think the last thing I'd pull out in terms of a lesson learned would be just the importance of communication. I think both communication with our citizens to explain how we are implementing sanctions, the impact it's having, and how we're tackling unintended consequences. But I think also the communication with business. And I think that's been really important, certainly from the UK's experience, in terms of how we design new and innovative measures. So I think the oil price cap, I think, was a really good example of that, where we coordinated very closely with other members of the G7 sanctioning coalition and business, and the guidance we produced, I think, was exactly in the right place. And I can think of countless examples where we've seen insights from business in terms of how our sanctions are being implemented and how we can improve the guidance. So I'd put out those three things. I think coordination, enforcement, communication.
Great. And Mike, turning to you, just from the United States perspective, would you agree? And is there anything that you would have done differently had you known this going in?
Thank you. Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that the investment in the multilateral architecture of enforcement now is really one of the key challenges before us. Now, of course, each of our national authorities might differ. Our capabilities might differ. Our investments in those functions might differ. And I think what the moment calls for is to ensure that we are harmonized, that we're coordinated, that we're exchanging information with one another, and ensuring that those channels are as robust as they can possibly be. That means that when we understand, and we're working to understand this better, the distinctions between our varying national regimes for administration and enforcement of sanctions, that we can also speak about how to make those more congruent. There are important distinctions between the way, for example, the European Union defines property that belongs to a sanctioned person and the way that we do. And so when we're sharing information about a particular subject of joint interest, how can we make sure that we can act on each side of the Atlantic to bring the maximum impact to bear? So I think that that's absolutely essential. I'll pick up on another point that David made, which is the communication. That's so incumbent upon us as enforcers, as regulators, to be very clear with the private sector about what our expectations are. We rely on the private sector, of course, to be on the front lines of our enforcement. In many ways, we've deputized the private sector to be our eyes and ears, to report what they see to us so that we can act accordingly. And at the same time, the private sector relies on us. We owe them clarity. We owe them responsiveness when questions arise. And we owe them, I think, from time to time, a reminder also that we're watching and we're paying attention, and we're bringing enforcement actions to underscore that. And so I think that's really where the front line is in so many ways, making sure that we have the range of authorities necessary to calibrate our engagement with the private sector and to bring enforcement actions when we see negligence as well as willful misconduct. Stop there.
Great. Thank you. And I do actually want to take a step back and just really discuss about what were the objectives of the financial sanctions when they first were levied against Russia and when they first came online. And just wonder, like, have they evolved over time as this situation has continued? And Darta, maybe if I could start with you.
Sure, thanks. I mean, let me take a step back maybe on objectives more generally. I mean, we always say we have three broad objectives for the sanctions we have imposed. The first one being, and I think this is in a large extent now the priority or the priority focus, is indeed to cripple Russia's military capability, and in that way also give the battlefield advantage to the Ukrainians on what is happening. The second one is to significantly reduce revenue that Russia is getting from, let's say, its commodities, its carbohydrates, and so on and so forth. And the third is, of course, to impose some significant pain on Russian economy as a large. And I think the financial sanctions really well correspond to the last two objectives, because I think, and David already referred to that, on the measures we had taken on the central bank assets. I mean, you know, in the 10th package of sanctions, we introduced in the EU an obligation on all the financial institutions and operators to report the amounts of central bank assets they hold. And I mean, now also our initial approximates have been confirmed that in the EU it's slightly more than 200 billion of those foreign assets. And of course, it's a massive amount to take out of Russia's ability to finance its war every day. So that's really the one part. And the second, I think, is really the measures targeted directly at the Russian financial sector. I mean, as of the early days of the war, we cut off effectively three quarters of Russian banking sector from refinancing on international markets. We have imposed the financial messaging service ban or de-swifting on the major Russian banks, including Sberbank. And of course, it has huge impacts on the ground and huge impacts on the economy there.
That's great. And actually, I want to pick up on what you mentioned about the Russian reserves, because I know that is a very hot topic right now of what to do with them. So if you could explain a little bit more about like the EU's proposal on how to handle this money, recognizing that so much is within EU jurisdictions.
I mean, in the EU, it's very much still its discussion. We are working on this because, of course, there is a lot of demand, a lot of questions raised, but I think also, and importantly, a lot of questions of legal nature and a lot of questions on, let's say, global financial safety net and so on. So a lot of these questions are raised, but we are certainly looking at it. I mean, this is currently being discussed by the member states in the council. We have created a dedicated working party to discuss that. They're meeting regularly. I think up until today they met 9 times, and next meetings are imminent. But I think key here is really to find so to say, the G7 or broader solution to the problem and broader agreement. And I think that discussion is also very much ongoing.
I did also want to go back to, because I think we all understand what the objectives of the sanctions were. I was wondering if you, and I open this up to the floor, what are the measures of effectiveness? I mean, are they different across different jurisdictions, recognizing that there's different amounts of money and different rules and authorities across them? Maybe if David, if you'd like to start.
So I think it links very much to the objectives that Darta outlined. And I would add one further objective to that, which is we're not trying to target the Russian people here. So we've made conscious policy choices to keep some trade flowing, whether it's in pharmaceuticals or food. But in terms of measures of effectiveness, I think the first is military supply chains. Are we successfully controlling the export of the most essential components? The EU, US, and UK have published simultaneously a common high-priority goods list, the stuff we care about the most. That's 45 types of goods. That is what we're focused on with our domestic business in terms of this is the stuff we need to stop finding its way to Russia, and it's finding its way sometimes through quite opaque routes. And it's also the focus of our lobbying with third countries. We're asking them to focus particularly on these type of goods. So one measure of effectiveness is how we see trade, Russia's ability to import those goods, because that has a direct impact on their ability on the battlefield. I think the second measure of effectiveness is, again, sort of linked to Darta's explanation of the objectives. On the financial stability of the Russian economy, I think the ability to impact on their revenues to fund the war. And I think a couple of things that have had a big impact there, particularly around the oil price cap, oil price revenues down near 50% in the first 6 months of this year. That trend is starting to tick up again, though, and I think that's where there'll be a lot of discussion in the next few weeks about how we challenge circumvention of the oil price cap and how we maintain the impact on that for as long as possible. So I think that's the second measure of success, how you see our collective efforts impacting on Russia's ability to fund the war. And maybe the third measure of success, which is probably the one which is hardest to observe directly, is an impact on Putin's calculus. Because ultimately, what we're trying to do is encourage and leverage Russia to get its troops out of Ukraine, because that's the quickest way to end the war.
Anything else?
Yeah, one on the walkover right next door is a big sign for Aeroflot, and it kind of highlights two of the ways in which I have seen export controls in particular being a very effective measure and tool in this fight. First and foremost, to go back to a point that's underscored by this panel, we think about global countries at the forefront of this, but then we must give a shout out to the private sector partners as well. When your companies and banks call in loans, they cancel insurance policies for planes like the ones at Aeroflot, or also demand things to be paid immediately. You take de-risking measures into your own hand. That's a significant success. And really that is something just as powerful as a criminal indictment or an asset seizure. But the sign also highlights a more practical and tangible outcome of these sanctions, which includes we are going after the procurement networks. We are going after and closing off the opportunities for the Russian military, the Russian government, to continuously get access to some of our most sensitive goods. And we see this in some of the most visual ways when Russian airlines need to scrape parts from old planes to retrofit the ones that they currently have to keep them up to par. And so it's an effort that we continue to aggressively pursue, but we do see these moving in the right direction.
And kind of picking up on that, recognizing that approximately 2/3 of the global population is living in countries that have not joined G7 and the coalition sanctions against Russia. Like, how can the G7 work with non-members to comply and enforce these sanctions against Russia? And I know all of you have been engaging with different counterparts around the world on this. So maybe, Darta, if I could give that to you.
No, absolutely. I mean, of course, we see that quite a significant part has decided to either abstain or remain neutral, and not to take a position really on the sanctions, especially. And I think, especially taking into account many of the political and geopolitical realities, the relationship that some of these countries have with Russia and in the region, I think, well, we might say we would wish it would be different, we would wish they would align or they would impose the sanctions, but I think we have to acknowledge and we have to respect that neutrality, if it's a neutrality. And I think then this is really the big question, if it's really a neutrality or if countries or their territory or their jurisdiction are actively used by malign actors to circumvent our sanctions. And then the question becomes very different, because of course one can choose not to take a position on this, but if it's our measures that are being circumvented through jurisdiction, I think it's a valid question to raise. And I think we've already touched upon this, and this is really the crucial point on outreach. And this is what the three parts here has done, I think, extensively, and I'm very, very pleased to say also jointly to a large extent, passing joint messages, traveling jointly the world. And this outreach really is bringing, I think, results. I mean, David already referred to the common high priority list that we have commonly crafted as a passing, as a very concrete ask to the third countries to cooperate with. And I think this is bearing results. But at the same time, of course, we have looked, and I think also in the EU, we have worked on developing the necessary tools also to address particularly and primarily third country companies or individuals or entities that are involved in these kind of practices. So also now with the latest package in the EU, we strengthen our general listing criteria for circumvention, so making it more viable to sanction individuals or entities in third countries imposing an asset freeze. But we also have, of course, the possibility of what we call the Annex 4 listings, where we can list third country companies, but also, of course, Russian companies, those close to Russian military complex. And I think there also the cooperation among the three sides has been exceptional on agreeing on these companies or finding these companies. But then, of course, we also have the latest anti-circumvention mechanism that we agreed with the member states, that the member states agreed just before the summer. But here I really would like to flag that this is very much subject to prior diplomatic outreach, to exhausting diplomatic means, and this is really, at this stage, it's our focus to work on that.
And then I know all of you have been traveling quite a bit for these different diplomatic engagements. I know, David, you've recently been in Central Asia. to address these different sanctions and export controls evasion issues. How has that engagement been going? I mean, are they receptive? Are they willing to see that it's kind of in their best interest to comply with these efforts, even if they're taking a neutral stance on the conflict?
So I think what's working is going to those countries with a realistic, targeted, consistent set of asks, and ideally doing that trilaterally, EU, UK, US, asking exactly the same thing. I think actually we're not talking about very large quantities of trade. These are specific items. You're not asking a country to cause itself significant economic damage. I think with countries like Kazakhstan, for example, we've seen a commitment to prevent re-export of goods. We've seen implementation on the ground, and you can start to see it showing up in the trade data. And I think that's the benchmark of success. If you can see those three things, a commitment, genuine implementation efforts, and then it's showing up in terms of customs data, you can see that those sensitive goods are no longer finding their way through Russia, at least directly. I would say generally in many of those countries there is a desire to comply with that relatively specific targeted ask, both because there are genuine reputational concerns, particularly from the private sector, but also because they recognize that we are going with something which is realistic, combined with an offer of support. So I think the assistance that the US, the EU, and ourselves have been offering those countries in terms of capacity building is making a difference as well. Of course, there is the sort of threat of targeted action against companies or individuals in those countries who are engaged in the most egregious and obvious forms of circumvention. And you talked a bit about alignment at the start of your comments, Kimberly, and I think that's an area where we've become increasingly aligned, is in that willingness to target those companies and individuals who we see are responsible for that trade. Because again, it's not a huge volume of trade and it's quite concentrated, so there are things we can do in the enforcement space as well.
That's great. And I actually do want to pick up on a point you raised about capacity building, because we see, or at least what we see from the think tank world, is that a lot of the potential export controls or sanctions evasion may be happening in countries that just do not have the capacity or is not as built up as, say, the EU member states or UK or US in these areas. What is the West doing to help these countries kind of develop the capacity they need?
Well, I've spent the week on the continent talking to counterparts about these issues, and here the capacity questions aren't really so much of resources so much, but the way that legal regimes are structured and the way that sort of enforcement is pursued can vary. And what I think we have had some very productive conversations about are very much along the lines that David and Darta described, about using the full range of authorities to encourage companies to comply, to understand what the regimes are. I think it's incumbent upon us also in terms of responsiveness to inquiries we receive from national governments, because oftentimes they're representing their companies, their economic interests to us through official channels, and will ask questions on behalf of their constituencies. And so we've invested a lot of time and effort in explaining the extent of our sanctions, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, so that they can go back and make risk-based decisions on their own. It's sometimes not just a question of investment in resources or having the underlying financial wherewithal to enforce, but simply a question of, or maybe not so simply, of ensuring that their different parts of the government can speak to each other, that the financial intelligence units that receive suspicious activity reports can share that information readily with administrative authorities who might have some sort of enforcement responsibility for sanctions, and that those authorities in turn can receive information from law enforcement authorities who are criminally prosecuting potential violations. And so a lot of it, I think, is well within the realm of possibility, even for states that haven't the capability necessarily to invest in the sort of robust enforcement and administrative infrastructure of the EU and the US and the UK.
No, absolutely. I think one thing that would just jump off is the direct engagement on the enforcement side. It is an area that wouldn't fall traditionally within the lanes of enforcement officers. But what we're noticing, especially in some of the countries where traditionally you would look at them and think that is a haven for money laundering or circumvention of sanctions. For whatever the motivation may be, we are seeing an opening here and an opportunity to really engage them directly. There is a willingness on their side that historically was not present to want to do something to change their act and their reputation. And so this past week, I sat down with a group of bankers from a particular country that we traditionally don't expect a lot of cooperation from. There's a desire for them to want to do more. There is a pleading from their part that their financial investigative unit becomes far more active in engaging FinCEN and our own authorities. And so we're going to seize on those, because it's not only about the immediate conflict that we have, it's about laying the foundation and the structure for the next conflict and ensuring that we have momentum that is permanent and some type of silver lining in this horrible situation in Ukraine coming out of this.
Yeah. That's great, and I appreciate that you raised FinCEN, my former role. But, and I do know and that FinCEN is also working very closely with the different FIUs around the world to try to bring more awareness to these issues. And they even just published a recent financial trend analysis highlighting where there's potential evasion and export controls. And I was just wondering, like, I know none of you are from the FIUs, but if you have any thoughts on how is that kind of FIU coordination working? Like we've seen through the repo task force and other different multilateral forums that there does seem to be great information sharing among, especially the FIU partners, where a lot of this information is coming from. And at least from my experience, that's not something we really saw at this level before. I don't, Mike, you want to?
From our perspective, since the invasion, we've seen a marked increase in what we call spontaneous disclosures, which are proactive reports of suspicious activity that our partner countries from the Egmont group of financial intelligence units receive. And it's really quite unprecedented, I think. And so much of that depends also on our willingness and our ability to share information about exactly the sorts of trends that we're seeing within the United States, extrapolating from that, reporting that, and then giving other countries a sense of the typologies that Russia and its networks of evaders and proxies are using to evade the sanctions. And so we've been receiving a lot of those, I think really at an unprecedented rate. We've been working to share those. And it really goes back to the investment in the institutions and the architecture. And also really, I think, in some ways, just a way of thinking of these challenges as truly multilateral and really trying to ensure that any barriers, bureaucratic barriers, technical barriers, are addressed and overcome. So I think it's been very promising.
Yeah, just to jump on that and to go back to your earlier question about non-G7 countries, I think one of the most practical and tangible ways that these countries have been able to assist some of our respective governments is through those type of disclosures. We have a certain existing set of laws that does not allow us to act, or we don't have the will to be able to act, but we know you can. So do with this information what you will, and we certainly are acting on that information. But it also is an interesting time for FinCEN itself as a regulator becoming more robust. Last year, they published jointly with the Commerce Department the first ever warning red letter on export control flags, red flags that industry should be on the lookout for. And so I think that's going to be the norm moving forward, where there is deeper cooperation and collaboration, not only with FIUs, but the FIU within our own country and how they work with regulators that they historically may not have worked that robustly with.
And I would just be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the movement of our former director at OFAC over to be the head of FinCEN. Ms. Andrea Gacki recently assumed that role, and so we're looking forward to even more cooperation with our FIU partners.
And David, is there anything on the UK side that you want to add in? I mean, I know even just within the past year, there's been a huge investment in economic statecraft and trying to build up the infrastructure in place. Is there anything you'd like to add?
So I think so exactly to Michael and David's points. I think all states are having to invest in their own domestic enforcement capabilities. And quite a lot of that it revolves around identifying those methodologies, those risk factors, those red flags, getting that guidance out to business, hearing from business the own insights that they have. So one of the things we found is that connecting the financial services sector with distributors and exporters, for example, both are seeing different parts of the picture, but if we can find a safe space for them to share those insights, we then have an even better picture of what's happening and we can share that. I think on our side, it's particularly building out capabilities that fall short of criminal prosecution. So to build a criminal prosecution takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of evidential gathering. I think there are things we can do well before that where engagement with businesses can deliver a result. One of the things we found useful in the UK system is having a strict liability civil monetary penalty for financial sanctions, breaches, and I think we're looking to do more in that area for trade sanctions as well.
That's great. Thank you.
And I have to say we are learning a lot from our US counterparts in that area.
I did want to pick up on some of the issues we talked about with enforcement and invasion. I mean, I feel like over the past couple of years, we really have seen Russia almost just continue to learn from the sanctions evasion that they had historically done. They've just kind of doubled down on that a little bit as they continue to try to evade sanctions. I was wondering if any of you would like to chime in on how have the sanctions evasion challenges evolved over the past year and a half? Has that created issues on the enforcement side? And if any of you have thoughts on what is Russia kind of learning about this space?
I think we've come really a long way. I mean, at the outset of the second most recent invasion, historically, our respective countries, I think we would all be willing to admit, there's a little bit of a mismatch in our respective sanction regimes and our ability to really assist each other and work collaboratively together. We have, as David pointed out, in the last 2 years, each country taken stock of what our limits are and what we can do to fill the gaps and get better at coordination. And so I think that's why the broadening of the definition of success is so important. It is not, I'm from the Department of Justice, Mike's from the Department of Treasury. If you were to ask us historically and our principles, there'd be a goal for our respective departments to be the first to get some type of disruption in play. That has changed, right? We have defined success broadly, not only within our country, but across the pond, to take into consideration that if a criminal indictment is not possible every single time, that's okay. As long as our regulators who have a strict liability legal standard or our foreign partners who may have higher equities are taking action. And that is the most powerful way to show that these programs are working. I think we've also learned through this process that silos need to come down. The Department of Justice has historically done a lot of sanctions prosecutions, a lot of export control prosecutions, but there wasn't really an orchestrated way of approaching these, of bringing OFAC, for example, early on so that they can, in parallel, make an assessment as to whether or not they can act where we may fall short. And so that way of thinking has changed. It is a legacy of our efforts to get better at this, and we'll continue to take stock and make changes as necessary moving forward.
Couldn't agree more, and I would just kind of remind myself sometimes about the challenge of the target that we're facing. Russia has been at this not since 2014. They've been at it really since 1949 and the advent of COCOM. And so they've had many decades to practice their efforts at sanctions evasion, their integration into the global economy, their willingness to use money in varying ways to co-opt persons throughout the globe in one way or another, really presents a remarkably challenging and difficult front. And so I think to David's point there, that our ability to evolve our authorities and to make sure that we can work closely with our partners so that if we can't take action in one country, let alone one department, that maybe somebody else can.
Perhaps I think what we also see is really with the routes or the schemes becoming increasingly complex, and sometimes they're really mind-boggling when you follow some of these trade routes that we see. I think the key thing is the information sharing and sort of the common analysis and common understanding of that information. I think this is what we really see in the member state level being done, and I think this was raised with the FIUs. I mean, FIUs, of course, in most of the member states, have a lot of capacity or experience already from a AML whole context and discussion, so they're having a lot of this know-how. And this is being spilled over. And I think, of course, on the Commission side, we are trying to give that guidance. We are trying to give some support, not only to member states, but what has been touched upon, certainly also companies, and that's crucial. But David already referred to this. I think it's also this quite remarkable way how we have cooperated on these kind of analysis on information sharing. I mean, just this Monday, EU Sanctions Envoy David O'Sullivan, he convened the international sanctions coordinators from G7, but way beyond, so with the like-minded partners, like-minded allies. We convened in Brussels to really discuss where we stand, what needs to be done, what are the patterns we see, and I think this is really, on all counts, unprecedented also in that regard.
Did you make that?
I would just add briefly, I think on the financial side, one of the things we've done is going after some of those financial enablers, those people that allow obfuscation of assets, and I think it goes to that point around really looking at your authorities and using them to the best of your ability to cause disruption. And then I think to Darta's point around how we've impacted on trading goods, this sometimes feels like a game of whack-a-mole, but actually whack-a-mole is success. Basically, yes. Every time we make it harder or more expensive for Russia to obtain particular goods, this is success, so putting as much grit into the system as possible.
That's great. I do appreciate how, David, how you discussed it, of like the definition of success has expanded. And I mean, DOJ used to be
whack-a-mole
is
success is going to be my new line. That's good. No, that's absolutely right. At the core of this, I know our task force at the very outset made a lot of efforts to go after the ostentatious, very loud wealths, your mega luxury yachts and planes, but the true bang for your buck, if you will, the where things will really make an impact is going after the facilitators, as David pointed out. These are people who have very special skill sets. To replace them will take time. They service multiple Russian elites at the same time. And to sanction them in a coordinated way, to investigate them in a coordinated way, to really try to neutralize their impact, that's going to be the deciding factor on how these sanctions really bear fruit at the end of the day.
If I may just pick up on that briefly, I think that another place to look for metrics of success is in Russia's response, exactly that. To what degree do they need to invest in new networks? To what degree do they need to incentivize those who they're working with? To what degree do they need to revisit their tax schemes, for example, in response to the price cap initiative? Because those are costs for them. And when they're focusing on that, they're not able to focus as much, at least, on some of the other things that they're doing. And so for us, keeping them guessing just as much as they can keep us guessing is really incumbent and part of the challenge.
And Darta, I wanted to ask you just from an EU perspective, because I think you're in a unique position where you have several member states that all have different rules, authorities. Does that create a lot of challenges in the enforcement space, just recognizing everyone kind of approaches things differently from a domestic standpoint?
I mean, of course, if you have 27 member states, and I mean, in our legal system, indeed, member states are at the forefront of implementation. So they are the ones responsible, but not only about for implementation, but also for enforcement. So this is all at the forefront of the member states, and I think really, and we've touched upon it many, many times, the challenge has been massive.
Yeah.
I mean, we had 40+ sanctions regimes before in the EU in place, both autonomous and Security Council mandated, but of course nothing comparable to this. So of course this is a huge challenge, but as I said, I think the response has been remarkable. We all have worked with and I think this I can say on behalf of us, we have worked with resources that we had at hand. We have worked with the knowledge we had at hand. The rise of that ability has been incredibly steep on all counts, but that doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't push or we shouldn't strengthen those capabilities, but this is exactly what is happening.
And before I turn it over to audience questions, I wanted to just get the group's thoughts. The G7 being used as a mechanism to coordinate economic sanctions, that had never been done before. Do you see this as kind of the movement forward of using the G7 in this way? Do you think it would ever expand to the G20? Or new mechanisms kind of developing out of the coordination that's going on across different partners against Russia?
I sure hope so. All of the G7 countries have invested a considerable amount of time over the last 2 years to sharpen our respective sanctions and export control regimes. And although it's not a perfect system, and we obviously will continue to push forward and more aggressively, there are tangible dividends that are coming out of that effort. And so we are seeing that in the way in which the Russian war machine is not able to be as successful as it wants to be. And whether it's continuing that in the Russian conflict or in a different conflict, my certainly hope is that we continue to leverage these powerful tools that we are only getting better at using. And so I think it'd be very hard to walk away from such an effective tool. And if anything, things, at least within the United States, for example, are indicative of us relying on these even more. To include, Darta talked about adding additional resources for her line of effort. The Department of Justice hired or is in the process of hiring 25 new federal prosecutors devoted exclusively to this problem set. We've anointed the first chief counsel and deputy chief counsel for corporate investigations, specifically with a national security perspective. In addition to my task force, there's the creation of the Disruptive Technology Strike Force, which is a joint venture between the National Security Division of DOJ and the Commerce Department. But that also has a significant footprint globally in that effort of trying to get our allies to fixate on export controls as a tool. So I'd be hard-pressed to see us investing in that path, in those permanent resources, and then walking back from them as an effective tool for the next conflict.
So it strikes that the G7 will continue to be a core nucleus of the multilateral efforts to respond to aggression of this nature. And I would also just acknowledge also the role that other key economies and partners play in the price cap coalition, for example, which goes beyond the G7. And I think that depending on the initiative and depending on the regime, we can see more or less, a core of G7 countries that is expanded on a somewhat ad hoc basis to include like-minded partners as well.
No, I mean, I, of course, very much concur with what has been said, but perhaps to give just the other angle, I think it's also we've seen that many of the measures, especially when we deal with the economy and when we deal with a jurisdiction the size of Russia, we've seen that many of the measures actually had their strength in being taken jointly. Mm-hmm. Because especially when we look at the financial sanctions that were taken, I mean, it would be very well if, let's say, the EU does it, but if, for instance, we don't have a common understanding with the partners, it simply would spill over somewhere else. And I think this is really the realization that we've had, that really the strength of what we are doing in many regards, also oil price cap, I think, is an excellent example. It has been in this unity, it has been in this cooperation that we have had.
Did you have anything to add?
I was speaking over coffee with a couple of people who were at the centre of government at the start of the crisis, the invasion of Ukraine. And I think one of the unique advantages of the G7 is you can move at speed. And I think that ability to react quickly, whether it's through political directors' networks or Sherpas' networks, I think that's a unique advantage. But I completely agree with the other speakers. It's not an exclusive club. We're working very closely with the Australians on the oil price cap. I think South Korea is playing a really important role on the goods side. And I think it's a basis to work from, but you can expand it depending on the issue.
And actually, it might be a good time to transition to audience questions. I will take a question from online audience first, and then I'll open it up to the people in the room, if that's okay. Because there is a question on the oil price cap. And I agree that it has been considered a success. But the question that we have is more focused on how it's being enforced. And do we anticipate, will there be secondary sanctions associated with the price cap at some point? What are the consequences that are being created if there's a new means of invasion that will make trade and finance less transparent or more dangerous? So I guess what next steps on the oil price cap?
Well, sure, just on the enforcement question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the same considerations that informed the development of the policy, which included maintaining global oil price stability, as well as reducing Russian oil revenues, I think also informs our approach to enforcement. We've been actively surveilling the universe of actors involved in shipping Russian oil. Of course, the violations arise when parties use G7 services, coalition services, to transport oil above the $60 cap. And so we've been working very closely with industry to monitor exactly what various carriers, shippers, traders, refiners are doing. We've seen a very high degree of responsiveness, I think, and so in many ways, I think it's been a success story of the industry successfully policing itself. And I think that really speaks to the broader view of enforcement that we at OFAC adopt, which is really that enforcement is in service of compliance. For us, it's not a punitive measure, it's an effort to ensure that people obey the law. And in the price cap, so far we've seen, I think, remarkable success in that respect. And when there's evidence of evasion of that, I think we're going to look very closely about what the appropriate response will be.
And now I'd like to turn it to the room. The gentleman in the back.
Christoph von Marschall, I'm a member of the Atlantic Brücke, but also a journalist with Der Tagesspiegel here in Berlin. I have to apologize that I want to a little bit disturb the happy talk about what we are doing together, because it seems to me that there are clear limits to this common approach. Certainly on sanctions on Russia, we try to be on the same page, but we are talking here about general economic statecraft. And if I recall the reactions of the European Union to the double crisis of pandemia and the war, I didn't have the feeling that the EU was consulting with the US before it decided on the Green Deal. The same is true with IRA in the States. We have tensions, how it applies to European economic interests. Again, no real consultation. China, do we have a common approach to China, which goes further than just to say, well, at the moment it's rather, it's not decoupling, it's de-risking. And I would challenge you on that approach. Didn't we really need much more? It seems to me that all these measures are tailored to the local politics, to local or national enterprises and so on. But there are clear limits on this transatlantic common approach to economic statecraft. Could you a little bit give us your ideas about this challenge?
Does anyone want to take that?
Well, I'm happy to say, look, we are all different countries. We are going to have different priorities. Our focus here is really on the common areas where we do agree on a path forward. And what we've highlighted for the last hour is the tremendous amount of progress that we as an alliance have made just in the last 2 years of not mirroring our respective sanctions program. That's impossible. We're all very sovereign and we're all different countries with different systems. But we have tried to bridge that gap. And we've had successes, and we'll continue to improve on those areas where we can. And we'll continue the great debates on the areas where we disagree.
That's fair.
100%. And I think that maybe the example of sanctions is a good model for how we can overcome differences. I think that the EU and the United States have not historically always seen eye to eye on these issues. And I think because of the core nature of our alliance more broadly, we've been able to discuss and to resolve them and move towards a condominium of sorts in where we agree we can act together, and where we disagree have open channels of communication to address them.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's really, I think this example of what we're discussing here today is really one of sort of a common identification of a common and incredibly high threat, not only for Europe, but globally, of course. And I think this has really been also then the shift in that thinking. And exactly as colleagues already said, I think there is a lot of very, very valuable lessons to be learned from that process on cooperation as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Just it's been interesting to see where there's the common narrative and we are all on the same page. That's where we can really advance together. The gentleman in the front. I think a microphone's coming for you.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I'm Tom O'Donnell. I work on energy and geopolitics. I've been based in Berlin for about 10 years, American. So I have a very specific question about the price cap, and that's reports that there's a significant amount of money that the Russian companies are holding outside the country. On the one hand, you can look at that's a success, and on the other hand, it's it's money that they have. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how that's handled. The other thing is more general, which I'm not sure if it's fair to ask you guys. This is more the people who set the policy. But the perspective has been that, it's a war and both sides escalate. So what would the next step be, is what I'm thinking about, in the sense that one idea is naturally a number of countries, Poland, the Baltic states, would like to squeeze the price cap more. Now that, the bureaucracy, if you want to call it, is in place, squeezing it. But what I would say is this. I understand the importance of trying to maintain, obviously, energy security, not to have too volatile a price. But from the very beginning, what a lot of us energy experts have said, and Fatih Birol has said a number of times at the IEA, the world has plenty of oil and gas. Russia could be completely replaced, and everything could work fine. So that's sort of another step that hasn't gotten to. So I had expected that if this goes well, or maybe if it goes farther, there could be a very positive program to encourage countries to invest in oil. There's plenty of it there, or not only in the United States, the Middle East and so forth, but what you need is a signal to the market. If the market knew 6 months from now, 9 months from now, there's maybe 6-month increments, something is going to be done that will reduce the amount of Russian oil that's easily available. That's a significant signal. And we know with all the products and with the product sanctions that were put on, for example, it was all priced in well before. So it's just a perspective what you might think of these.
Well, just with respect to the money Russia holds abroad, it was not the goal of the price cap or any of our sanctions to lock up all of Russia's funds. We don't have comprehensive sanctions on Russia. It is a broad program, but certainly, it very much depends on whose assets they are. And if they don't belong to a sanctioned entity, then they can be locked up and they can be used as long as it's not for something that violates another set of restrictions, export control restrictions, or the like. And of course, they're finding ways to do that, but that's what our whole panel has been about, is policing that. With respect to the broader question, I think that there is a very active ongoing dialogue. The coalition speaks regularly, and there are different elements of each of our governments that are responsible for different aspects of the price cap initiative. And so we have a compliance and enforcement channel, and then we have our economists and energy experts speak actively. So I'm afraid I won't have too much to say about what is in the offing, but I can tell you that it's been very responsive to energy market developments, and there are a number of ideas always being discussed to ensure that the goals of the price cap, energy stability, reducing Russian oil revenues, are met. And I think on that latter point, I think we've seen significant success so far. So we'll keep doing that.
The gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Moritz Groth from Berlin Global Advisors. Over the course of this week and the past, reports have emerged that Germany and perhaps other European Union member states have been buying up refined products, oil products from India, where obviously a lot of the crude oil exports from Russia has moved to in the wake of the sanctions, the EU sanctions on crude oil deliveries from Russia. Are there any plans on the side of the European Union or its member states to restrict that trade, even if it is currently technically legal?
No, I mean, exactly as you pointed out, currently, technically, there is no violation of EU sanctions with this happening. If the crude is refined in any third country and then travels to Europe. I must say, don't know the exact numbers, but I do not think, especially when it comes to the final products, the refined products, that it's such a huge proportion of our overall market. But we see, and I think that also links to the previous question, I mean, we see a lot of more EU-wide general thinking of diversify and sort of look at alternative also ways of energy in different ways and different energy sources and also on alternative energy sources.
And the gentleman in the front.
Yes, please. I'm Wolfgang Barry-Schmidt. I'm with a military background, and I'm a young leader of the Atlantic Brücke and a lawyer in Munich. The question goes, and I'd very much be interested to hear your opinions on what can be done, should be done, quickly as possible, with regards to convincing Saudi Arabia not to cooperate with Russia. And nobody knowing what the enormous ramifications will be economically, inflation, etc. Thank you so much.
Mike, do you want to take that, or?
Well, I think broadly speaking, the security relationship with Saudi Arabia is very close, and I think you can read in press reports about ongoing discussions about ways to further strengthen that. And I would just say, very broadly speaking, that I think as we, become more engaged and security relationships tighten as a general principle, I think we're better able to shape the strategic decisions of our partners. And so I think that is playing out as we speak.
The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, Rudy Bachmann, University of Notre Dame, a member of the Atlantic Brücke. I heard a lot of shoulder padding, and in some ways, I guess it's justified. Your impressive measures were done. You called it unprecedented. But the term unprecedented in some ways is also a bit irrelevant in some sense. And so what I heard little about is, in terms of evidence-based policy, an empirical evaluation, a detailed empirical evaluation, what part of the sanctions actually worked, which part didn't work. It's almost surely the case that some worked, some didn't not work so well. And in particular, in respect to the way we have, the timing we have introduced the sanctions. I know no economic model, no political model, no strategic model, no theory that would tell you that you should slowly step up these sanctions. Any model I know of strategic interaction will tell you, you've got to go in for the max immediately. And I understand that there are political constraints that may not make this possible, but thinking about this for the next conflict, or how are you thinking about this aspect and this dimension of imposing sanctions for the next conflict?
David, would you like to take that?
So I think that's a really interesting perspective. I think I would go back to the point around what would be the counterfactual if we hadn't imposed these sanctions. I think if we hadn't imposed the sanctions, the Russian state would have at least an additional 400 billion in revenue to spend on its war efforts, if you take into account the impact of the oil price cap, the immobilized assets, and freezing of state assets. We measure to the best we can, the impact of our sanctions and the different types of sanctions very regularly. We produce very regular reports for our ministers on this. It looks at, for example, what we're seeing in terms of the impact of our trade measures, particularly in relation to those common high priority goods. It looks at the impact of the oil price cap. The thing that's a bit harder to measure is the long-term impact on the Russian economy. So one of the things we haven't really talked about yet today is how that impact in terms of the 900,000 talented Russians who've left Russia, the impact of Western divestment, how that is impacting on Russia's longer-term future. I think that's something that's going to become increasingly a focus over the next few months because you can see the discomfort level rising amongst elements of Russian society. I think the challenges for the ruble over the summer, I think, brought that home. So in answer to your question, we are measuring it. Some bits are easier to measure than others. I think on the point about going all in at once, obviously we're in a sort of political context here, and I think there were times at which we were ready to go and times at which we needed to wait a little until the politics were right and the economics were right. But I think that's a natural response. We're trying to do something which impacts on Russia without impacting disproportionately on ourselves.
And with that, we are at time for our panel. So I would like to thank all of you for your time today and for sharing your insights. This was a great discussion. Thank you.